up, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Street Theology, where we bring theology to a street level. It's your boy, Pastor Derek. I'm glad to be with you all, and I am here with my co-host of today, none other than our expressions architect, Michelle Warner is in the building. Michelle, what's up?
Hello, everybody. It's fun to have you as the primary host today. It makes me excited.
This is a little bit different. I gotta admit, there's a skill to this.
Yes.
Shout out to Pastor Adrian. And certainly not least, we've got our experienced architect in the building, leader extraordinaire. What's up, Trey Zoda?
Happy to be here.
Yeah. All right. Well, guys, as you know, listen, there's probably a really something that we really need to talk about, and that is maybe it's your favorite holiday or not. I'm not quite sure, but Thanksgiving is this week for us. And so, man, let's talk, because food is one of those things that everybody's looking forward to. And so I want to know, Trey, Michelle, I want to know top dessert for Thanksgiving. What is going to be the creme de la creme? What's going to top off all the stuff that you're going to consume on Thursday?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Okay, so this Thanksgiving, we're doing a little non-traditionally. We decided to do a Hispanic Thanksgiving. Okay. So we're doing like paella, tostones, and flan. So I guess the flan would be the thing that
help us out.
Paella is like yellow rice with lots of seafood, chicken, chorizo, which is like a sausage. And you cook some of it on the stove. The rest goes in the oven. Tostones are fried plantains, and they're the best things ever when you have the right sauce. And then flan is like a creamy, custardy kind of dessert. We're making it a little bit Americanized because we're making it pumpkin. And then we'll have some coquito, which is like Hispanic eggnog.
About coquito. Yeah. I can't wait to have some one day, because all I hear it is the jam. Yeah. Trey, what about you?
So this year we're actually going to my brother-in-law's and being with him and his family, and his wife's tradition is that she makes everybody their own dessert individually.
So cute.
So I was called like twice, hey, what dessert do you want? And then I found out, we're gonna have a silk pie, we're gonna have pumpkin pie, like sweet potato, apple, and I was like, I mean, is there another option? I don't really know. I personally don't want to eat a whole pie, but I would say normally kind of a maybe unusual Thanksgiving dessert. I really love banana pudding, and so when we have that at Thanksgiving, that is like the number one thing.
Yeah. I actually don't know what is in store this Thanksgiving, what's on the menu, but man, I'm really craving some cheesecake. That is probably not a normal, that's not a normal like Thanksgiving thing that you have. I'm just really craving a good cheesecake. I used to didn't like cheesecake. I didn't like the texture. It felt a little bit too thick for me, but now I guess my palate has changed. I really love raspberry, Oreo, all kinds of cheesecake. So it's pretty good. Thank y'all so much for letting us know. If y'all out there, you want to drop something in the wherever you're consuming this, you want to tell us what your favorite dessert is, please feel free to do that. We're going to jump into this episode of Street Theology. This is episode 50, guys. This is episode 50 for us. This is so we figured, man, this one is about pure gold, right? If you got a 50th anniversary, right? It's your golden anniversary. And I'm really excited about our guest for today. Our guest has actually been here on Street Theology before. And man, I'm listening and reading some stuff by our guest, just a reminder that we are not just the church that's gathered, but we are the church that's scattered. And so for you guys out there, it doesn't matter if you're at Engaged Church, if it doesn't matter if you're our cousins, our aunts around there, maybe you're not at Engaged Church, but you just kind of get down with this idea of innovative reconcilers, that God has actually called us not just in the four walls of the church, but this addition of Genesis 1, 26 to 28, and Matthew 28, where God is like, hey, man, go into the world, make something of it. Take culture, be royal stewards of this earth, so to speak, and do something. So we're not just gathered, we're scattered. And I don't think there's anyone better to come and talk to us about this than the one, the only, Dr. Gregg Okesson. Welcome, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. It's great to be back, and I'm just sitting here thinking, how can I get invited to Michelle's house for Thanksgiving?
You are welcome anytime. Anytime.
Okay,
that sounds like the ideal Thanksgiving meal. And
listen, yep.
I'm just gonna go ahead and throw the shade, Dr. Gregg. I don't have an invite. I work with her, and I've never. actually, Michelle, we might have to talk about this off camera.
Yeah, we can talk about
it. I'm glad that you were doing well, sir. Just to kind of start us off, you were on the podcast before, and maybe others haven't listened. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do, and then tell us kind of what is on your heart lately. What are you learning lately?
Yeah, so who I am is always a complex question to answer. So I'm a third generation missionary to Africa, so that's pretty important to me. Long history of missions in Africa. So Africa has shaped who I am. Wow. Lived in 4 countries, 3 continents. My kids are biracial, so we're confused, but in a good way. And I joke about that, but that's actually, I think, where the world is taking us. I think, you know, we've created, we've kind of mapped out the world in certain categories, and I feel like, you know, those Christmas snow globes that your grandmother might have sitting on her shelf, you know, God has chosen to shake our world. And I think there's really beautiful things, really painful things happening in that shaking. So I'm a missiologist. So I care about the gospel, I care about culture, I care about the church, I care about the intersection of those 3 things, and have been researching congregations for a couple decades, if not more. So that's who I am.
Yeah,
man, that's awesome. And what right now? What's the most primary thing on your heart, or what's the thing that you're kind of digesting and learning right now?
Yeah, well, you know, I think it's really fascinating to kind of walk, you know, somebody who has spent kind of a whole career in Africa, coming back to North America and seeing all that we're going through, and seeing that missions and missiology is more needed in the West than at any other time in my life. And because we've got changing socio-ethnic templates happening in the United States, and that's coming with obviously a great amount of pain, but also great amount of joy. Migration, we've got incredible secularization happening in parts of the country, but along with that secularization, we have kind of what we might call like spiritualization, like renewal of people wanting the spiritual in the midst of secularization.
Wow.
Which so I think just looking at how, you know, the church in North America is wrestling with COVID, wrestling with cultural forms of Christianity, Christian nationalism, race and ethnicity are huge issues. So that's you know, so to have spent a career in Africa and coming back and now looking at the North American church through missiological lenses is kind of what I've been doing.
That's really good. Do you feel like, you mentioned some of the changes that you've seen in the church over the last decade. Do you feel like 2020 is probably the biggest change the local church has experienced? And I guess also what are you hoping for in the local church as we kind of transition through a lot of these changes?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm probably not big enough to answer that question. I think the church is facing a lot of fear right now, and we're not used to facing fear. You know, I think we've had, especially the white church in North America is facing issues of marginalization, both real and perceived, and I think that's really healthy for the church.
Yeah.
But it comes with a great amount of pain. I think COVID has accentuated that. So even churches that have, you know, been the, you know, kind of the majority culture are wrestling with their marginalization. You know, people are not coming back in some cases to churches like they were before. I think what we've seen politically is just, you know, unlike anything I've seen in my lifetime, and I was old enough to remember Vietnam and what the church, you know, church in North America wrestled with there. So So I think those are a lot of, I think looking at North American church as a new mission field is not a new concept, but I think we've got to look at it with new lenses as a mission field.
I just have a quick question to ask, just so that that everyone that's listening can understand. I feel like the need to ask this, which is for you, and because we're going to talk a lot about local church, and even just for our listeners, that's something that may not necessarily be that people may be wondering why. And so maybe we should even started there. But for you, why do you have such an emphasis on the local church? I think that's a great to just kind of hear your heart.
Yeah, and I would be among many who have been very discouraged with local congregations. I was a pastor here in North America, have seen a lot of ugliness in local congregations, but I've also seen some of the best things that I've ever seen anywhere have happened in local congregations. So Leslie Newbegin, who's one of my heroes, he talks about the local congregation as the hermeneutic of the gospel. And I really think that that's so important, because we've allowed the gospel to be privatized and individualized and a whole assortment of other things. But I think what we find in local congregations are communities, a community that lives embodiment, social relationships. I think all of these things are so much a part of the gospel. I mean, when Christ came into the world, he didn't come into the world with an idea. He came as a person. And he gathered a community, a diverse community around him. And I think we're called to do the same. And COVID has made the embodiment part hard, but I think we all know that, there's just something beautiful about laughter and love and hugs and crying together. And I think the church has an opportunity to do that in ways that no political ideology can do, no political party can do, no business can do. I think that's the essence of the gospel.
Thank you for that.
That's really good.
Yeah.
So I listened to you spoke in March about the church as a public witness, and I listened to that recently, and so I have a lot of questions from that. But in one of them, you had talked about diversity being a gift, and how the church is called to lead in that space. And even just in terms of what you said about community and being a body and sharing those emotions and the laughing and the crying, supporting all of that together, I guess bringing it down culturally, something that we're all experiencing and dealing with recently is the verdict with Kyle Rittenhouse, and then the pending verdict on the Ahmaud Arbery case. How is your community dealing with that, and what do you see the church as a community? Like, how can we lead well in the midst of all of that?
Yeah, that's an incredible question. You're throwing the hard ones at me. It's such a hard issue, and so I do believe deep down, I believe theologically, I believe missiologically that diversity, and I think it's important that diversity is not an end in itself. Diversity is for the purpose of unity, but it's a different kind of unity. So there's one kind of unity in which we all look the same and we all talk the same, and I walk into the room and I can use language and just assume that you are going to understand the language that I'm using. But there's another kind of unity in which we're all different. We come from different backgrounds, and I can't make those assumptions. And so I need to listen better. I need to be corrected. I need to ask for forgiveness from you. And I think that it's that kind of unity that God is calling the church to.
Wow.
So, And we see that all throughout scripture. We see that great prayer in John 17, that they might be one. Christ is praying this, that they might be one as we are one, so that the whole world would know.
That's
And
great.
what I love about churches like yours and the church that I'm a part of is that we're trying to live into these realities, and it's uncomfortable. So when we come to what's happening, in our world, like these two cases that you talked about, I think it is so important for us to just acknowledge that sin doesn't just sit individually, but sin does actually enter into our systems and structures. And the moment we start saying that, people, fear Marxism and socialism, and that I hear those concerns, and we need to be, we need to be aware of being co-opted by any political ideologies.
Really?
But the reality is that sin does not just sit in individual personal lives. And so our nation has a sordid history with race. And I just think it's important for churches to be able to say that. And the other thing that I think is really important is that we need real honest conversations. Now, sometimes sermons are not the best place to have it, but I think communities where we're just sitting and just talking and giving each other space to share anger and hurt coming out of these verdicts, and not be threatened by that anger and hurt, but just be able to say, well, explain to me. And we just don't talk well. So then what happens, as you know, is that because we don't talk face to face and listen to each other, we get on social media, and then just, it's kind of, we're all passive aggressives.
Yeah.
And then social media is the outlet for us to just, spew forth whatever we want. And I think the problem is that the church just is not providing places. So our church that we've planted, that's with Every Nation, we're even in pre-launch, we walked through a 6-week series on reconciliation. And I just thought that, and then we did a 4-week series on public witness. So before we even formally launched, we I think the idea was we've got to have reconciliation and public witness a part of our DNA before we even become, officially a church.
That's great.
So you asked about what we're trying to do. I think those are attempts.
Really, really good.
Dr. Okesson, to go off what you were just saying, kind of about diversity, and then also the comment that you made earlier about the church being marginalized, I kind of go to a place of thinking about even within the church, marginalized. And one of the things that I've heard a lot recently, and again, this is sometimes more from a social media sphere where this information comes from, but it's this idea of losing your culture to pick up a kingdom culture. But oftentimes when this is said, it comes from white Christians to Black and Hispanic Christians. So I'm just kind of curious what your perspective is on that.
Yeah. So let me make a really provocative statement, just to kind of
This is the place to do it. Yes.
what we do. First of all, there's no such thing as a kingdom culture.
Wow.
There's no such thing as a Christian culture. Because that almost assumes that we can disrobe ourselves of our own culture and occupy. Now, if what people mean by kingdom culture is a culture of forgiveness and love and repentance and the gospel, okay, that I don't have a problem with you calling that a kingdom culture. But the beautiful thing about and sometimes the baffling thing about the gospel is that we can never let go of our culture. We can never be acultural. And so that's, even Jesus was a man in first century Palestine. I mean, that's the beauty of the incarnation, right? He didn't reject being a man. He didn't reject being a first century, a Jewish person living in, that world and that time.
Mhm.
That is central to the incarnation. So we are always embedded in culture.
Mhm.
Now, I think what people mean is that I think white people feel like their culture is being attacked.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think anytime we attack culture, I mean, blacks in North America have faced this for centuries. So
Mhm.
in many ways, this is or Latinas. I think this is in some ways a new thing for white people. And I think the challenge is for us to send a message that all cultures need to be critiqued by the gospel, but then all cultures also need to be affirmed by the gospel. So I think this is that culture is not the problem. I think it's sin within culture that is the problem. And so
Mhm.
by the incarnation, by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we need to say yes to parts of culture that are, testaments to the presence of God in our midst.
Mhm.
But by the cross of Jesus Christ, we need to say no to cultural elements that oppose the gospel. And I think
Yeah.
that's the challenge as we interact with people anybody who feels like their culture is being attacked, is that we've got to say that that God always, the gospel is always incarnated in culture,
Mhm.
and that we are not to reject or disrobe. There's really a Gnosticism to that we can disrobe ourselves of culture,
Mhm.
but we've always got to be challenging our culture. I tell people all the time that if you love something, if you really, really love it, you need to critique it through the gospel of Jesus
Good.
Christ. And so I don't think that it's anti-patriotic. I don't think it's anti-American. I think we've got to allow all culture to be critiqued by the gospel. So I don't know, Trey, if I answered your question, or if you want to follow up.
No, I think that was great.
I may have a follow up to that. When just like reading or listening to you, I think what I'm getting is that like this idea of that culture essentially is how you order reality, how everybody orders their reality. And we know like for a long time, the Western society has kind of, I guess maybe ordered that for everybody. So there's a sense of like, well, we do like judge people for their culture. So I don't know if I don't know if this is a follow up, but how do we begin to change that perspective? And if your answer is pretty much going to be the same, I would then say I would love to hear some of the follow up to what are some things that in cultures that as you study them, as you've seen them, as you've been a person asking questions, what are those things that in different cultures you can say, yes, that thing that this culture is doing right here is a testament to Christ himself, to God's kingdom.
Yeah, it's great. So one of the things, and again, this is why I love missiology and think that we need more missiology in this world, is that we think we understand culture. We live in culture, but that's actually one of the most dangerous things that you can actually say, is that, well, all we need is the Bible. Well, absolutely, we need the Bible, but the Bible was actually written in many different cultures itself.
Wow.
And whenever we read scripture, or we interpret the world, we're doing so through our cultural lenses. So you use the language of order. So cultures do that. Cultures order reality for people. Cultures are a system. There's something that is, there's some integration to it. And when one piece of a culture gets, there's a challenge to it, the whole order or the whole system feels that. So I think one of the most important things for us as Christians to do is to actually learn to study culture and to see culture, because we're always interpreting life through cultural lenses. We've got to make ideologies visible. We all have ideologies. And the problem is that we've really allowed ourselves to just be divided by the political ideologies of our world, that we've just kind of
That's great.
allowed ourselves to be in step, whereas we have to actually always be out of step. That doesn't mean that we have to, reject everything, but it just means that the gospel of Jesus Christ and the community that is the hermeneutic of the gospel needs to be that which is always coloring how we interpret culture. So I think I think because we have neglected culture, we have allowed ourselves to essentially be co-opted by predominant cultural, and that's not just an anti-conservative. It'd be against our progressive brothers and sisters as well, and because the gospel is always challenging us to be out of step with the realities of our world. So to follow up with your question, I think that there are always beautiful things in every culture. I'll tell you this one story. I was living in Africa after 9/11, and those were really hard days to live overseas. There were bombings that happened in Kenya, where I was living, as well as Tanzania. We had to have bags packed for evacuation. To be an American was we were constantly, the US Embassy was telling us to stay out of high populated areas. Our own government was waging wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were just really hard days to, and I was wrestling with, what does it mean to be an American living abroad during that time? So I was at a theological school working there, and there was an old German man who came, and he was visiting. And we were walking and talking, and he said, "Are you American?" And I felt a check in my spirit, I wasn't sure whether to pass myself off as being Canadian by saying "a" at the end of. I'm joking, but I just felt this check, and I said to him, I said, I am an American, but I'm not sure whether how to make sense of that, whether I should apologize. And he grabbed my arm, and he said, I was in Berlin after World War II, and what the American government did for our nation. He said, please don't ever apologize for being an American. And those were powerful words that I heard, because I think these days, if you challenge anything of America, and when we say America, it's often white America, because that's the dominant culture. People think that you're not patriotic, but I think the challenge is that all cultures have beautiful elements. I mean, the way that I've been shaped by my African brothers and sisters is deeper and more profound than anything I can even tell you. So we do have to have lenses to see the good in culture, as well as to challenge that which is wrong.
Yeah, and just before you jump into, I do want to challenge everybody that's listening too, because hearing that, one of the things that just automatically challenges in me is, number one, to see the flattening of our world by the internet, to actually see that as a good gift from God, that now you get exposed to other cultures and how they are seeing the gospel. We've got more books at our hand. We got you can listen to sermons. All these types of things are actually gifts to us, so that we could actually get different glimpses of God. But the convicting part for me was almost like you were saying, Dr. Gregg, like it almost hits me like the reason that I have not done that, read a theologian of a different, that's German or African or something like that, is because, and you can see how closely they're linked, because somehow I feel like the gospel is American. It will be unpatriotic. Like they're going to teach me something wrong. Something I'm going to pick up something that's wrong. And it's not quite unpatriotic, but it's that same feeling that I'm doing something wrong. And I just wanted to challenge everybody listening, man. Like we have a great gift. We have these things at our disposal. So thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
That.
They can start with Bonhoeffer, right?
Oh man. I have like follow-up questions, comments to that, but I have a different question that I want to ask. If this is not appropriate, we can just cut it from the podcast, but I'm like genuinely curious because I'm listening to you talk about culture, and I am not white. And so as a not white person, I personally don't understand how I don't know what white culture is. So that could be a question for you. It could be a question for Trey. If you guys both want to like explain your perception of it or how you understand it, because to me, I equate it a lot of times with patriotism, but I don't think that's the fullness of it. So I'm just curious. I guess what are your guys' takes on what white culture is?
That's a good question.
Yeah, and this is a hard one in America because in many ways, white culture has been the dominant culture of America, for a couple hundred years. So, individualism, freedom, a particular reading of freedom, kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality. This notion that we can accomplish whatever we want to. Which really was seen kind of in, the early waves of immigration. But it's really hard to talk about white culture because in many ways to talk about white culture is in many ways to talk about kind of the dominant culture that we've seen in the United States. And when the closer you are to something, the closer you are to culture, in one sense, you're able to interpret it at a different point, but that you actually, it's harder for you to see it.
Okay.
So anthropologists actually talk about the study of anthropology helps us to see that which is strange as familiar and that which is familiar as strange. And I think that we have to be able to kind of lean deeper into these realities. Trey, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, just kind of as you were talking, I think it's interesting thinking about from say 1776 till now, seeing the how white culture has been shaped over time, especially thinking about like through the Industrial Revolution and then also through the establishment of the country, that there does become this weird mix of white nationalism with white Christianity that kind of begins to mesh together to where there becomes this joining of God and country almost become this one thing, and that there's this patriotism that's there. And then like into the 50s and into like the Jesus movement of the 60s and 70s, then you start getting into this weird idea of capitalism and being the master of your own destiny, but also at the same time serving a God who is supposed to be the master of your own destiny. So there becomes this kind of like juxtaposition that happens between those two things to post-modernity, moving into this ideas around radical individualism and the separating yourself from that. But at the same time, due to kind of the current political landscape, there becomes this, the white nationalism, white patriotism that kind of has become way more immersive in the culture today.
Wow. Well said.
Well said. Interesting. Well.
Or, Michelle, I think the answer you were probably looking for was white bread, hot dogs, and July 4th, but...
Cornflakes. Baseball, yeah.
I figured I'd try to give you the more intelligent answer first.
Oh God. Yeah. Okay. Because honestly, the reason why I always think that question is because even to your comment earlier about Thanksgiving and with food, like I feel like in Black and Hispanic culture, because I'm both, is a lot of it revolves around food. It's like, what kind of food are you eating? What are we bringing to the table? And then when I think of like white or American culture, it's very much like. Literally, like I think of like a grill, I guess.
Yeah.
But
You want to say boring? Is that what
no,
you're-
I mean, there are plenty of memes that would do that for me.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm exposing myself a little bit, but my friend and I talk about this sometimes. Depending on whose house we go to, we bring our own spices, just in case.
I'm right there with you.
Oh gosh, but anyways, going back to one of the messages that we listened to recently from you, you had talked, and it was mind-blowing because we've been talking about this a lot here, about how we're seeing this huge shift of millennials and Gen Z leaving the church. And it's been really interesting because we've been studying Gen Z a lot to figure out how to reach them like in our local context, which has been super fun with one of the outreaches we've done here. And you mentioned how one of the things that's causing them to leave is hypocrisy. So I wanted you to unpack that a little bit for us, and then if you see any other reasons why specifically Gen Z might be leaving, like what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of reasons, and so we talk about the nuns and the duns, in the West, people who have never had. So I think the more society becomes secularized, the more nuns you're going to find, people who really don't have any background tradition in Christianity. And, multiple generations. So you're seeing this a lot in Europe. So the number of people who just don't know really anything about the Judeo-Christian heritage. They don't know about the Bible. They don't know what the gospel is. They don't know who Jesus is. Duns would be something that we're increasingly facing here in North America. People who actually, they were birthed into kind of a deep religious Christianity, but for a number of different reasons, often because of hurts, they have just given up the church. So we call them the nuns. And I think that generation, I think it values authenticity. I hear this from my students all the time.
Yeah.
And the older generation, it's that's not a value, and I think that's where the hypocrisy comes in. I think I was actually meeting with some students recently, and a student actually shared that we have a student shared this. We have a deep distrust of authority.
Wow.
Deep distrust of structures and institutions.
Wow.
And so I think that's a major challenge that we've got to face as the church, because first of all, authority is redeemable. I believe that very strongly. And actually institutions are actually part of our humanity. I mean, part of what humans do is they institutionalize. We develop systems, we develop structures. Now, completely hear what Gen Z and millennials are saying, because they actually what many of them are doing is they're rejecting the institutional church, but then looking for their own spiritualities that are. So they're not rejecting, in many cases, they're not even rejecting Christ, but the way that they've seen, the church operate, it just has not been this grace-filled, this community that lives out hope. And so the challenge that I would give to millennials and Gen Z is to just say that not all authority is bad. We actually need authority in our lives. and that the authority is redeemable. I actually believe that institutions are redeemable. In my role, I'm a provost, which means that I'm immersed in an institution. And I want people to understand that institutions can be healthy,
Yeah.
and that they can serve people. So that would be the message I would try and give to millennials and Gen Z. But to other people who are serving millennials and Gen Z, I would say that we've really got to value authenticity, which in a gospel kind of way. I think vulnerability. I think we've got to be able to admit. My kids have seen me cry numerous times, and that's not, it's not enjoyable for me. But I think that I think that we need to be able to mirror or image that. I think the other reason that Gen Zs and millennials are leaving the church is that they live in a very complex world where things just are not clear cut. They're not all broken up into boxes with labels. And then when they come into the church, we're just giving them really simplistic answers to highly complex problems. And I think we've got to be able to acknowledge to them and involve them in, poverty, racism. I mean, these are incredibly complex problems.
Right.
Our world, and we've got, even as pastors, to say, hey, listen, brothers and sisters, I do not have all the answers. I mean, I'm deeply filled with a desire to have the Holy Spirit teach us and to be immersed in God's world, but that doesn't mean that I know the answers to poverty or racism. I think that's part of the authenticity is being able to say we live in a complex world, and our churches are going to wrestle with these complex realities and not just try and say, well, you just need to trust Jesus and believe. Well, yeah, we need to trust Jesus and believe, but we also are called to live in a world where there is so much pain.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah.
I know one of the things that we kind of say around here is that anxiety can speed you up or slow you down, and that it causes really black and white thinking, and that ultimately it causes simple solutions to complex problems. And so would you say, and I know you did kind of touch on it briefly there, but would you say that a lot of the reason that the church is giving these inauthentic, simple solutions comes out of a place of just the mass amount of anxiety that is saturated in the culture today, and that the church probably is feeling a sense of mass anxiety over not having the answer, not being able to be the solution?
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that your question is a great answer. And just affirm that, whenever we do face fear and anxiety, we want to anchor people, and people need to be anchored. So I think, let's not give up the authority of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let's never give that up. And actually, I think my own journey has been deeper and deeper into the beauty and the extravagantness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I think it's actually possible to go deeper into authority, and but without and deeper into complexity. But I think, Trey, as your question intimates, that we feel so much that we want to kind of wrap things up into a package with a nice bow on top of it and give it to people. But I think that actually can hurt people in the process of discipleship, because you kind of give them the answer, they stick it in their pocket, and they say, okay, well, I've got the answer. Or what's happening with Gen Z and millennials is they're saying, I don't see that. And the world that I live in, it's not that simple. And so I'm going to go look for answers someplace else.
If I can throw a zinger at you real quick, what would you? Well, you said that institutions can be redeemed. In your mind, is there a crucial thing amongst other things that have to happen? Is there a crucial thing that must happen in order to redeem an institution? I think that's a
really
very
good.
good question, considering systemic things and all kinds of stuff that people talk about now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would give what's going to sound like a simplistic answer, but it's actually complex. Power has to be redeemed, because institutions form by power, and this is, and power is actually part of our humanity. I mean, you go back to the Genesis account that God created male and female, and he said, go out and rule. And this word rule, of course, interpreting rule before sin comes in the world. What does rule look like before sin comes? And it really is agency, it's power, it's stewardship, it's shepherding, there's all this language. So institutions are formed they're by power dynamics. And and this is the book I'm working on right now, is what does redeemed power look like in the context of leadership? Because we just, it's one of those areas that we all talk about power like we know what it is, but you go to a theological school and you talk about sanctification, and you talk about creation, and you talk about eschatology, but we don't address power. And yet so much of our world does revolve around power. So again, I think we've got to give more energy to that, but it also gets us into systemic issues. It gets us into people marginalization. Actually, I think it takes us deeper into the life of Christ, actually.
Yeah, it's good.
I know. And when can we have you back again?
Problem is, I'm in administration now, which means that my writing is slowing down. But yeah, in many ways, I've been teaching on this topic for a couple decades, because I actually early on, started teaching leadership and said, well, how do you teach leadership without power? And I started going out there and saying, well, where are there good theologies of power? And they're just not there. And how do you deal with institutions and structures? How do you deal with development? How do you deal with poverty? I mean, all these things. Actually, my dissertation dealt with a lot of issues of power. So it'll probably be a few years.
Okay.
Be anxiously waiting.
I
know. So another thing that you've spoken about before are the ideas of particularity and universality. I was wondering if you could unpack that, especially around the idea of not letting the majority culture's particularity to dictate universality for everybody.
Yeah, and I think to do that well, we actually just have to go back to Scripture and tell the story of Scripture, because it's always easy for us to universality is one of these things, to even the earlier comment about a kingdom culture kind of comes back to this issue that if we define a kingdom culture, it's very easy for that to be defined by whoever is in the majority, who is essentially calling the shots, so to speak, or writing the book, so to speak. So, you have this beautiful story that is, we call it the mission of God, which begins in a garden with a man and a woman, and God. I mean, there's incredible particularity that is there. And then you end with this city, this incredibly diverse city in Revelation 21, all tongues, all tribes. So you have this amazing picture of universality, but without ever leaving particularity behind. So it's this generic universality. It's not this universality of sameness. No, it's a universality of unified allegiance to Christ. It's a universality of of, as Ephesians 4 and 5 talk about, there's one gospel, there's one hope, there's one spirit. It is a universality that is held together by Christ. But I am never asked to reject, for example, my maleness in order to be in the kingdom of God. I'm never asked to reject my whiteness to be in the kingdom of God. And what happens is, the story is that unfolds, and we'd need several hours to tell this story, is that God is constantly weaving in particularity. I mean, just look at the Old Testament. Abraham is called from a far distant place. He's brought and he's blessed. And he says, and I will make you a blessing to all the nations. And then God is constantly weaving in Gentiles and women into this story, such that when we get to Jesus's genealogy, it's not a uniform genealogy. It's not a bunch of just white men, or I should say Jewish men. There's women in there. There's Gentiles in there. There's sinners in there, right?
Yeah.
And then you go through Jesus's life, and you get to in the book of Acts, and Peter in his, what we call his second conversion. His first conversion was to Christ, but his second conversion was the Gentiles can be filled with the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
Which was just so dramatic for him. So I think it's just this beautiful story, and I think we have an opportunity. Your church is living this reality. Our church is trying to live this reality, is that we don't tell people, leave your culture behind, take it off when you come to church, but we actually want you to bring it, but we want everybody to make it open to the gospel of Jesus Christ and open to each other as we embody the gospel.
To even go off everything that you just said and tying it back to the earlier point, it just makes me more excited for the book, because now it's because really what you're saying is it's just this constant empowerment, right? The right application of power that's being used that allows us all to be different but together. I don't know. That's just really profound.
Yeah. It's so good. Yeah, it makes me excited as well. I know if Pastor Adrian was here, he'd probably have about 52 follow-up questions for you, because we also do work in consulting and diversity, equity, inclusion, and a lot of what he talks about is power. If we're going to do diversity well throughout an organization, we have to give power away. And it's just like that concept of what you said, kingdom ethics within quote-unquote secular organizations. So it's cool. It's cool to hear. I guess one more question. Would be for everybody who's listening and not watching on YouTube. There's probably like 200 books in the background of what we're looking at. So in one of your messages, you talked about how we need different eyes to see together. And so based on all the books behind you, I know you're listening to a lot of different eyes, different voices. Who are some of the top people you're looking to be able to hear and see better?
Yeah, so in many ways, my story, and I shared with you, I'm a third generation missionary, and there's a missiologist, Brian Stanley, talks about reverse conversion, where missionaries go to a location to share the gospel with other people. And in the process, they actually become changed themselves. It's not a religious conversion, but their lenses get changed. And in many ways, I dedicated my most recent book to a village in Tanzania and my students at my seminary in Kenya, because they have shaped my lenses so dramatically. I think I tell people it's such an exciting time to be a missiologist, perhaps the most exciting time since the early church. We've got migration, we've got the movement of people. We just are being forced out of our silos, and that comes with pain, and it comes with fear and anxiety, and not all of it is healthy. but the growth of world Christianity around the world. So read African brothers and sisters, read Latin American brothers and sisters, read Asian brothers and sisters. I mean, there's really just tremendous insights that are coming out of these areas. And that's not to neglect the diversity just in North America that we need. I've used Esau McCulley's book, Black, in a couple courses, which is, I think, so helpful, and students have really responded well to me using that. So it's not that we have to cross international time zones, but there is just so much resource that is starting to emerge. One of the things that we do at our seminary is that we have a visiting scholar program where every semester we give 3 to 5 to 7 visiting scholars from around the world. We give them a house, we give them food, and give them an opportunity to write their book from Asbury.
Wow.
And for one, it's going to serve everybody because these books are going to be available to everybody to read. But there's maybe in a good selfish kind of way, they're right on our campus eating in our dining hall. And so the opportunity to get them into our classrooms, to have them preach. We had a beautiful, lovely man who's a principal of a theological school in Sri Lanka who preached in chapel just last week. And I think just in many ways, the people who have shaped my theological lenses so dramatically are people who are from these majority world contexts. So really just embracing the incredible resources that are coming out of world Christianity, and understanding that part of that is from within North America as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gregg. It has been an absolute pleasure. You've added so much value to us, and so I want to say thanks for your time. But then I can't let you leave without kind of putting you on the spot. So this is kind of like, how we talked about like Gen Z and authenticity. So I'm kind of put you on the spot here a little bit. You got a lot of books back there, like Michelle said. Which one of those are your favorite, Mr. Authenticity? which one are you like? Is that even possible? I don't even know if that's possible. But like, what was the first thing come to your brain?
It all depends on the topic, so and then I'm gonna kind of sidestep in the sense that C.S. Lewis has made a profound impact on me. I think he has an amazing ability to speak through narrative and myth. So C.S. Lewis's writings. I mentioned Sri Lanka. One of my favorite theologians is Vinuth Ramachandra, and he's just and we're actually bringing him to campus next year. And so Andrew Walls is a British missiologist who I just think so much of his writings have played such a profound impact. So those would be a few, but again, it all depends on which topic. N.T. Wright, I think N.T. Wright and biblical studies is, and again, one of the things that N.T. Wright does well is he helps people understand the large narrative. Christopher Wright does the same with the Mission of God. So helping, because so much of we all live a narrative, and actually helping us to see that we are all part of God's story, and that his generosity welcomes us into that. But so and the funny thing is that I actually gave away 2/3 of my books when we were in Africa. I gave them to our seminary. Because I didn't want to transport them from Africa.
Yeah, gosh, that's crazy. That's 1/3.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gregg. We really appreciate your time. And listen, guys, thank you all so much for joining us this episode of Street Theology. Give us a like, give us some star ratings on there, and we will see you guys next time on Street Theology.